So hello everyone. My name is Sandy O'Sullivan and I'm a Wiradjuri trans non-binary person. I am a professor of Indigenous Studies at Macquarie University, and I'm here with Dr Han Reardon-Smith, and I'm going to do a little brief introduction to them. That's what you get, Han, when you're the person who's not speaking at the moment. I'm reading off your information, but of course, I know you very well and know that it goes well beyond this. So, of course, Han and I both use they, them pronouns. Han is a queer, trans, white, colonial, settler, flutist, electronic musician, improviser, radio producer, community organizer, writer, researcher, and thinker, living on the unceded land of the Yagara, Jagara, Yugurapol, and Turrbal people. They are a postdoctoral research associate at the Centre for Global Indigenous Futures, which is where we both work, of course, and the Department of Indigenous Studies at Macquarie Uni. And they support my ARC Future Fellowship project, which is called Saving Lives, Mapping the Influence of Indigenous LGBTQ plus creative artists. I think there might be an A in there as well. Fabulous. Thank you for being here. I have lots of things that I am, but I'm not going to bother about reading off mine, except to say that, yeah, I was really lucky to get some funding to be able to take some time off in my research focus, which is kind of all over the shop, to look at some very specific work around Indigenous LGBTIQA plus representation, I suppose, broadly, but representation through creative practice. So, so I'm going to not speak too much about that. People can read about it if they want, and we'll include in the description below some links to some things that talk about the project overall. We've published a bit on it already, and we continue to publish out of it. But it relies on, it's the work of other people, you know, so it's our work, but it's thinking about what other people are making. And so we've done a lot of work recently on queer as, which I'll run through as we go through the slides. So this is basically a slideshow, but we wanted to do a review of what we've been doing for the last year in terms of some of our travel, which has necessarily engaged with people elsewhere. Some of it's been wonderful, and some of it's been difficult. You know, the wonderful is people, the difficult is sometimes institutions, and then the absence of kind of queer representation, but particularly queer Indigenous representation. So, so we were originally did this as part of the Trans Awareness Week 2023. But we've just hauled back on having that one publicly available because one of the participants is just doing a lot of very sensitive work at the moment, and just wanted to wait for a little bit of time to have that material come out publicly. And so if people attended that or registered for it, they can still see that that video, but otherwise, hopefully what we're doing is bundling up our stuff. Unfortunately, what it means is that you didn't get to hear distinguished Professor Bronwyn Carlson introduce us. Bronwyn is the head of both the director of the Centre for Global Indigenous Futures and also the Department of Indigenous Studies, and has a really important leadership role in thinking about this complexity of who we are as Indigenous people.
So, and who has like really led a department that's specifically focused on the kinds of complexities that arise with Indigenous queerness. Really the leading institute in Australia to be thinking about these questions with not just a singular queer or trans Indigenous scholar, but really a great collective of minds and thinkers working in this department from various kinds of queer and trans perspectives. So yeah.
Absolutely. And it's been good because part of what often happens in the queer studies area is that Indigenous people become exceptionalized, and really we're not going to exceptionalize ourselves. So it doesn't make sense to do that. And it also just doesn't make sense for us, for our community to do that. Instead, we take the position that we're in community. And that we're in a broader community with non-Indigenous people too, including non-Indigenous scholars like yourself. So I'll drag up the PowerPoint just so that we can have a look at some of the images that have informed. Let me play from start. So we exist, we've always existed, and we will always exist is our central point. It kind of riffs off of Visner's notion of Indigenous survivance, which talks about the idea that if we exist now, we existed in the past, and we exist in the future. It's a continuum. This is true for trans people, of course, but oftentimes what we hear is a very reductive view of Indigenous people. So a lot of our work has been challenging that within this. And of course, we're in a really good position to be challenging that because we've got these artists who are making work that are about these insistences. So because this is for Trans Awareness Week, we're really kind of focused on trans experiences. However, we're thinking more broadly about queerness, and those distinctions are distinctions that are really complex, and they're not always in people's individual bodies or their own experiences. And so it's really important to recognize that as well. So we had originally done the work the presentation the other day with Maddie Day. And we're going to talk about Maddie through this as well. And again, Maddie's doing this incredibly important work that is challenging trans disinformation. They're a Fulbright scholar at the moment in Connecticut, at Southern Connecticut University in Turtle Island, the area that people often think of as the United States. The work that they're doing there is very powerful in understanding the policies, programs, and resistances that are happening across this other space, so that we can translate it to where we are. And they'll have a whole lot more to say on that. So again, you can see this is the Centre for Global Indigenous Futures. I centre the work that I do, and by extension, Hannah's centering their work as well on this notion of Yindamara Winangana, this idea of knowing how to live well in a world worth living in. It's a very active thing. It's like, make that world. It's not, hopefully it's good. It's very much about Professor Watergo's fuck hope, and much more about the idea of creating and forming that world, so as much as we can. So I mentioned before that we do this queer representation, and this isn't just Indigenous representation. This is kind of what we've termed as complex representation. We've written about the reasons why elsewhere, so I won't go into huge detail about it here, except to say that this was a bit of a backdrop to some of the travel work that we did. We had a survey, or continue to have a survey that's out, which you can take if you'd like to.
Yep, it's open till the end of January at least, and where it's open to everyone. You don't need to be Indigenous, you don't need to be queer, but it's about how you interact with and understand characters and the queerness that they're representing in particularly serialized television representations, and how that queerness goes beyond just like, the idea of complex queerness, I guess, is this there being other factors that complicate an idea of someone being a lesbian or gay or even bisexual or trans, although we are already thinking those through more complex lenses, and wanting to just kind of, I guess, in the sort of like homonormative framework of like still fitting very comfortably, especially into white often settler colonial, but Eurological kind of representations as this, one factor outlier from normalcy, and instead looking at what happens when somebody is not only queer but Indigenous or otherwise racially, marked in some way, and that or culturally, and that plays into their characterization and how that builds up over time and how that's explored, or have a disability, or there's many other ways that this plays out. Certainly, any kind of non-binary trans representation is a very complex, in particular because of the way it challenges the really accepted static kind of parameters of cis normativity, cisgendered representations, and heterosexual representations that kind of set up expectations for particular narrative forms. But instead, seeing the ways that these characters and the way that their characterization plays out can challenge the normative narratives that, that shape what we think of as, like, it shapes the imaginary that we exist within. So I hope that's a okay summary.
It absolutely does. And I got to call you up on some of that or call you out on some of that, because you kept saying or, and in fact, a lot of the work that we're doing is and.
Absolutely.
So, so a lot of the work that we're doing is challenging the silos of these ideas so that people are just writing about one thing or another thing or another thing or another thing, or they're saying, I really care about that character because they're this. But actually, there's a complexity to how people care about characters. And there's a complexity to what they're doing to help us live in the world. So the reason that this matters is, but believe it or not, people watch TV more than they ever did, or they watch whether it's on TV or not, they're watching this kind of serial form drama. And so, or comedy or whatever, but this idea of scripted form is something that people are really engaged with. And we're interested in work that sits outside of that too now. We've started to think about reality TV. We've started to think about these other forms because they're representations that are available to people not in their everyday life. It's this idea that it is there. And the notion of the and, one of the things that we're often hearing, as I've just rested on this, but I'm not going to talk through this, you can read it. One of the things that we often hear is this idea that trans people are excluded from Indigenous community. Well, first of all, it's not any truer than it is of any other community, but also I would challenge that it's true at all. I would say that individuals can experience disconnection, and sometimes communities can be, subject to religious and other kind of influences, including, some government influences, of course, because that's the Colonial Project of Gender. It is about reinforcing these ideas of the container that people belong in. And so the work that we do is about reinforcing that the Colonial Project of Gender is nonsense, and that rather than the or, it's the and. So communities are capable of going, cis women and men exist, trans women and men exist, trans non-binary people exist. There's not an idea of a zero-sum game where if one exists, then other people don't. And we're seeing that complexity in some of those representations that we've been talking about. The reason that we focus on representation, because it's like the big R word, it's really problematic in a lot of ways, because it's often used as this very blunt tool. And we don't, we want to challenge that, and we challenge that in the work that we're doing. So, so we've got these projects that are a part of this, and then centrally we've got something that sits behind us as a kind of a thesis. So this notion of the Colonial Project of Gender, Sexuality and Everything Else is about recognizing that there's never been an agreement. So no cession, no concession, no conceding of land back, right? Here I am on Kabi Kabi land back. And, we're in this space of understanding gender and the colony in relation to that, but also on resisting it. So we have resistances that are about the complexity of our identities, that are about belonging in our communities. So we were really lucky. I was really lucky, and I'm going to say lucky, even though, you know, it's a really fraught term. But it was, it happened by a set of very strange coincidences that I found myself earlier this year in Tulsa at the Indigenous Child Health Conference, which is mostly set up by two pediatric organisations or associations, which is the Canadian Pediatric Association and the US-based one. There were certainly some other people there, but there was a conference with around 1,000 people attending. We had about 300 to 400 people in a plenary that I presented in alongside three Indigenous paediatricians who, including two-spirit paediatricians. So the leader of that group, they won't mind me saying that, was Shakita Bell, Dr. Shakita Bell, who is native Black paediatrician, professor of medicine and director of Odessa Brown Children's Hospital in Seattle. And here is a picture of us all together. I'm going to use selfies a lot through this, and I'm using them really strategically. I think it's incredibly important for us to put faces to names, but to also, it's more than that. It's about being physically in that space, being able to capture that moment. And it's about visibility. Like, we've talked a little bit about the importance of visibility, but mostly we've been invisible in these spaces. And so this is a visibility of queerness. It's a visibility of indigeneity. It's, you know, a visibility of connectedness that we have through talking, as we did at this conference. This might have been us having dinner afterwards, but it was also us on the just after the plenary in the case of, so just introduce the other two people that you see on the screen. So that is Dr. River Cornelius and Dr. Ryan Guru. And so the four of us in this plenary were talking about trans-affirming care and talking about how gender-affirming care is important for not just children and young people who are accessing it, but also for their parents and their family and their community at large. We had the good luck to there was a few things that were
with a little bit planned,
involved,
but yes.
and a bit of planning of visiting Dr. Bell. This is a remarkable facility that they're at, but one of the lines that they used earlier this year and used again with us in taking us through this very large clinic. It's part of a broader hospital. So my understanding is that this part of it doesn't have emergent care, but it's part of a system that has emergent care that's available to people who are low or no income. And that's the gender affirming care as primary care. It's a great line. You know, if you need a line to give to people, it's a good line. So that's my terrible selfie. Sorry, I managed to get some out of focus of the team that was traveling. So this is Leandra Wallace, Alana Blakers, and Han, and Dr. Cornelius and Dr. Bell. This is the hospital from the outside. It's a very large space. I actually think this doesn't do it justice. It's very big. And it's a very relaxed space to be in. It was a remarkable process to see art incorporated all the way through the outside of the building and the inside of the building. And the art was there to provide context. It wasn't just there to
pretty up an otherwise like clinical space. Yeah.
Exactly. What did you think of the way that art kept appearing? I mean, we had, for instance, the person who founded this in 1960.
I can't remember the year wrong. I would also get the year wrong, but
mid to late 60s, and then they died just the year after. I think it might have been 69, and then I think they died in 1970 or 71. So it had their story as a part of the artwork as well.
Yeah,
so.
I think that was really important, that it like embedded the story of Odessa Brown, which is a continuing story, including in the staff in the hospital, that one of Odessa Brown's like descendants, or like continues to work in that space, and that there is also other ways that the story of the place is included in the artwork. That there's there's some works that are specifically set up with some digital photography included on projection reels and things like this, but there's also it functioned as well to create particularly what they called the town square inside the hospital, where it really functioned to create these spaces that were kind of describing the work that was being done, and the way that that's different to what in especially like settler colonial societies we've come to think of or come to expect from medical institutions in clinical spaces, where you go into this one little box to see one doctor, and then you have to travel across the city to go into another little box to see a specialist. And instead, it's kind of like situating those children in a home base, and the doctors then come to them. And I was so impressed with the way that changed the entire environment, and also like it kind of described the changes that were happening structurally, procedurally, institutionally throughout the building, and then going down to there's a dental space in the same building, so that families that are facing a whole lot of other challenges in their lives, particularly low income, migrant backgrounds, Black and Indigenous children and their families, they're able to access these essential services by just coming to this place, and it all kind of comes to them, and it centers around them in this way that is so like, it's revolutionary in the way that I think medical care is understood by so many of us, in these urological spaces. So yeah.
So important, and and important that a space that is working for these communities is beautiful and welcoming all at the same time. But that idea of access to services that are usually about being put off was incredibly powerful. And again, there's some very specific work that Dr. Bell has done around issues to do with gender affirming care and some specific diseases or illnesses that are affecting some communities over others. And so a kind of interaction of that is often what's missing. So it's been really powerful to see that kind of work too, because it's often siloed as this idea of puberty blockers, for instance, or it's siloed in these ways that are actually incredibly unhelpful. So yeah, that's been,
and maybe directly relevant to that is the fact that particularly two of these doctors that we've mentioned here, Dr. Shakita Bell and Dr. River Cornelius, are not just medical practitioners, but also really incredible artists in their own right.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think the fact that they each have these arts practices, they're really like extraordinary people, and I don't know how they do it, but that they have these arts practices, that's part of their life and their relationship to their work and to themselves and to their communities, that I think comes through in this kind of work that does weave together different aspects. So yeah, I just wanted to drop that in.
Absolutely. And they're constantly, including Dr. Guru, thinking about strategies to change policy, strategies to help people understand their way of being in the world. And one of those was through this slide that I have up at the moment, is Celebrating Our Magic, which was originally put together in 2019, which has some important resources that are specific to the area, but are also really interesting in a generic way, not too generic. They're still specifically about community, but you know, it's understanding some of the concerns that exist, it's understanding some of the opportunities that exist, and it's understanding who, um, in particular, um, Two-Spirit youth are, and they're specifically here talking about people who are thinking about gender affirming in some way. However, they're not only talking about that, they're actually talking about a whole lot of ideas of queerness, because again, these areas blend together. You know, it's not silo. You know, it's not an or, it's often an and. And we were really impressed by this, but you know, part of what we had here, I have someone wonderful who did an amazing performance for us in Toronto, but I think when we visit somewhere like the hospital, when we visit and see this kind of wonderful performance work, we see these amazing representations, solutions, support, backdrop. And while we can simply focus on those, it's really important that we focus on the absences, and that we don't just call out the presence of things, that if you have a lot of money, time and resources, you're able to go and locate. But the things that, as a young person living in a community who might have access to a museum, is not seeing because it's not present in that space. And so it's important for us to talk about that as well. So yes, I imagined going out. This is like the what you imagine you're going to see, what you actually see. And this is wonderful stuff. You know, these are amazing museums. This is the uh, uh, First Americans Museum in Oklahoma City in Oklahoma. And it's probably the largest Indigenous museum in the world. It's really got an amazing amount of complexity that's present throughout this. It's very focused on telling story. There's a lot of, in the museum's context, what we talk of as kind of 2D representations. And so that's images and text that are telling a lot of this story. There's a lot of video material. It covers off, doesn't go from deep time to contemporary era. It covers off mostly on contemporary life, but it does talk about history as well. It's run by First Nations communities. It's this is curated and put together by largely Indigenous curators, and not just Indigenous curators, but Native curators who are from this place. You know, so they're from the 6 to 7 communities that form the area that this has a focus on, which is around the area that's now called Oklahoma. And, you know, so it's quite complex in the way that it talks about everything from service to society to, you know, a lot of very fun, kind of jokey renderings and so on. And so it's really beautifully done. And there is absolutely nothing about queerness in there. There is nothing that mentions LGBTIQA plus people. There is nothing that talks about Two-Spirit people. There's nothing. Now, that's not to suggest that there's nobody present in the space. In fact, somebody that we meet just a little bit later in this presentation, Hulea Tinadashi, is in there with an artwork, but there's no mention of her being a queer artist. So anyway, this is worrying, not because, you know, people don't have museums are not people, museums don't have a responsibility to represent all, but when they say they are and they're not doing, it's interesting. So, and again, I don't come from this community, so I don't know if in fact there is a voice for this, there is a desire for this, but I do know that there will be queer Indigenous kids going into this space and finding that there isn't anyone who represents them as queer kids.
Yes.
But I also don't want to make some kind of weird overarching idea that somehow the more progressive states have a a kind of moral anchor to this, because in fact what I found was that oftentimes it was in unusual places that I was seeing complexity of queer Indigenous identity. I think it's often about individuals, and it's often about the need to have that. So of course it's more important here than it is in New York, where we found very little outside of some high art contexts. This is a space called the Center for Queer Prairie Studies. And sorry, I'm dominating the conversation and I'll hand it over in a sec, but it's just because I was actually only present for this bit of it, and Han then joined me for the next stages and then for this last trip, which was the west coast of Turtle Island. So we're using the term Turtle Island to talk about that part of what is also framed as North America. Of the US and Canada in particular are the two kind of colonial entities that that we've been engaged with, and there is some complexity around that too that we have and are writing about. So I was here in Tulsa at that Indigenous Child Health Conference, and I visited the Center for Queer Prairie Studies. It is not a center, it is a kind of riffing off the notion of a center as an art space, but it is also drawing in the idea, bless you, of the public imaginary that we sometimes see that artists can do to make something real, making something real by calling it out. So I think about Anita Heiss's work, where she talks and writes and then writes several books that bring in this idea of a national Aboriginal gallery. It doesn't exist. She even makes a space for it in Canberra. And of course, out of that, many years later, we see the beginnings of that kind of space happening. That's actually how you make things real, by writing about them and sort of insisting through it. So the Centre for Queer Prairie Studies may well exist, but it certainly existed for a moment in time while this exhibition was up. It was funded by the equivalent of the local council, but also all of the local arts organisations, and that's very powerful for somewhere that is otherwise fairly conservative. And this was the time that that I was presenting alongside the paediatricians, and yes, I'm completely the wrong person, but you wouldn't believe it, we don't, as far as we know, have an Indigenous paediatrician at all in this country. And so part of what we do is we argue for that now, right? But we come to view this at the time, and do the plenary at the time that there are all of these horrible anti-trans laws being passed that are oftentimes divided into kind of three areas. One is denying trans affirming care, including ongoing medical and surgical care. And the other is access to public restrooms for people who are trans. And then the third one is the kind of banning of resources, books, right, and libraries. So all of these three things were happening at the time in Oklahoma, in Arkansas, in Texas, the areas that I was traveling around and looking at some of this representation in public domain. So it's important to say that this existed and that it was actually available for people. Here is a representation or a bit of the story of Lynn Riggs. I'm not going to go into detail about Riggs's work, except that they were a queer Indigenous person across the first part of the 20th century. They had benefit of land back, which was a land back process of allotment. You know, it's very limited, but it is more than we had here. And the allotment, the Cherokee allotment, which is what he had access to, allowed him to be able to lease out or rent out the allotment for use, and to be able to use those funds to move to New York, to be off country, move to New York and write. And he wrote a whole lot of pastoral work, including Where the Green Grass Grows, which was later made into Oklahoma, the musical. So there you go, queer Cherokee man. So those kinds of revelations are the revelations we expect in museums. We expect to find ourselves located in those spaces. I won't go into huge detail about this, except to say the Steel Yard in Providence, Rhode Island, again, community-based work that centres Indigenous involvement. Hayley Peters, who is a Mashpee Wampanoag citizen, is one of the people who leads the training and support for people making in the space. These kinds of community organisations that were accessible for people outside of universities and government were just really important to see. And in some ways, they were a salve to this very, very central way of looking at representation that you see in museums. Representation in museums is pretty terrible, but it's also the thing that we're all forced into seeing as kids. You know, so there becomes a kind of knowledge of how to engage with museums. So I did a major project where I looked at 470 museums over a 7 to 9 year period. And it was out of that I wanted to think about queerness and queer Indigenous representation in this, mostly again, because they're not really fit for purpose, but they're what we have. And they have a responsibility to represent who we are as people, right? So we saw some good stuff. This is Coyote Park, who's Two-Spirit Indigenous. This is the way that they describe themselves. This is a work at Leslie Loman. It was very, very powerful work, you know, obviously very centered on the body and very centered on that kind of high art representation that you see. This is again, seem to be missing the descriptor from this one, but again, this is work that sat alongside it, looking at complexity of identity within historic New York. It's actually 70s through 90s, but then the reconfiguring of it from a much earlier period as well. And this is where I'm going to throw over to you, because you're here.
Yeah, so I believe this was on the same day that we visited Leslie Loman. We also wandered through to, this is Stonewall Pub, and you know, it was the daytime and the pub is, you know, smaller than you imagine, and this kind of thing. Prof Sandy had visited before, but I hadn't been in before, so it was wonderful to be there with them and sit down and have a beer and look at the pictures around the walls. In particular, to see, you know, prominent pictures of Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, and a lot of the history was kind of documented in this space as a museum in many ways, but as a kind of living one that people interact with still as a pub. I mean, it was also surrounded by a lot of construction and a memorial project, you know, that's led by state forces that does quite a lot of work in erasure of some of that story, as we know, has been something that is, you know, very much entangled with the story of Stonewall and the resistance movement that really, you know, exploded there, that was also alongside a lot of other resistances that aren't so prominent in our narratives of the history of queer liberation. So it was pretty special to visit that place. There was also stories of the different queer flags that we're used to seeing, and the people that had created the particular image, why they'd chosen the colors, why they'd chosen the particular format. And, you know, some of them in particular, I remember reading about the creation of the lesbian flag and how it was much more inclusive than, you know, we're told to believe, sort of historical representations of lesbians as two cis women, or WLW women love women, but instead to really recognize it as being something that does transcend gender and especially cisgender representation. So it was really special to visit that place too.
Yeah, oh, that's really interesting. I hadn't really necessarily thought of that, but I do want to call you out on one thing, and that's that, like, you make it sound really cool that we were there having beers. We were there having non-alcoholic beers. This is actually 6 months later, and I don't think you were there actually, Han. This was with Ilana. And just a reminder that bars often reassert, you know, this idea, Black Lives Matter, then the diversity flag, and then a no bigots sign. And we were seeing a lot of this in places that we were going to, you know, during our trips. It was obviously we had to eat, so we did go out to places to eat, but also we were going into bookstores, we were going into other places where there is very active resistance. You know, when we were in the neighborhood in Philadelphia, we went into a space that was owned by an individual as a bookstore, but then was taken over by the AIDS Project as a space to fund their ongoing activities. Pretty nice. But also just speaks to how there's slippage across this idea of the community and the individual within that. Now we have Dr. Percy Lezard. Earlier, we had, this was actually at Sydney World Pride. There's a little bit of resistance from us where I'm smiling inappropriately. Percy is pulling the face that they would pull with this, because it's kind of the whole idea of separating out, but also the idea of including, you know. So all of this was, you know, it's really important that we bear witness within this space. So Dr. Percy Lezard is a dear colleague of ours, and they visited us at the centre. Here's a bit of queer Indigenous joy. There's Tate hiding in mid laugh. And again, this idea of joy as resistance, and stoicism is not the only way to kind of present resistance, even though in other instances you might see people looking a bit stoic. This is our impromptu elders and babies tent at the Two Spirit Power in Toronto. And this was our group for the day that was there. It was a remarkable event to have queer people coming together, and people coming together to kind of witness queer people for people who are not queer, and finding their place in that. And so we have distinguished Professor Bronwyn Carlson there, and of course a whole lot of other people that are dear colleagues from, you know, near and far. And in this space, we were able to see people performing as themselves, and performing as not themselves, doing all of the work that is very complex in power, and being able to be there and not be forced into very specific gender roles that may only be available to them in other power. And so it was very, you know, it was powerful, and it felt like community.
Yeah. And it was, you know, there was, I was really struck by, you know, it wasn't, as opposed to some particularly settler-led queer events, it wasn't like really specifically just queer folks. And it also, you know, wasn't centered around, you know, nightlife or that kind of thing. It was like this just really joyous family, very much family gathering, that really everyone was welcome at, that did center Two-Spirit folks, but in a way that didn't exceptionalize or like put people on pedestals, but instead, like, normalized doesn't sound right, but instead just celebrated by bringing community together in that way. And yeah, it had such a different feel to me than other queer events that I've been to, other, I mean, a lot of other kinds of events and event spaces, because it was so centered around being in community with one another, and in particular celebrating being in community with queer folks. And yeah, that was extraordinary. It was amazing to be invited to that.
It was. We had a lot of Powerade. So
it was a very hot day. Yeah.
It was a really hot day, yeah. I think what was, I've mentioned Dr. Lazard, and we'll, in the information below, link to a report that they did. They have done this remarkable work on reminding the state in Canada that with murdered and missing women and girls, there has also been a lot of Two-Spirit people who are either women and girls, or not or and also this has included Two-Spirit people. And it's a remarkable document, not only because it speaks to a lot of this pain and speaks to the importance of the inclusion, but because it starts to look at some definitions that are actually really helpful. I don't think there's like one right document, but I think that what we have is we have conversations that are manifest in some of these reports that are available, and they help us be in conversation with our families and our communities and with our providers, and in this case with the state. And Dr. Lazard's work has just been really powerful in that. So jumping over to you.
Yeah. Okay, this was really particularly extraordinary. This is mentioned earlier, Prof mentioned earlier, the amazing Professor Hulea Sinanani's work. I hope Sinanani's work. And also here we have the amazing Veronica, sorry, what's Veronica's name? Pasalaka, yeah. So Veronica and Hulea, who both together run the Gorman Museum, which is in Davis in California. Yeah, so at UC Davis, where Professor Sinanani also teaches. And we had the extraordinary joy to visit not only the Gorman Museum and see the exhibit there that was extraordinary, that featured artists from definitely from across Turtle Island, but really focused on artists that are local to that region, so situated near what's the lands claimed by California, and also to visit Hulea's own private studio and to see a sort of cross section of the work that she's done throughout her career, and how that her fine arts practice developed to include photography, and has now developed to include also curation and a large embedded piece at the Gorman Museum, a sculptural cultural piece that is really opens the or it invites people visiting the museum to kind of enter a space that is then structured or presented with that as a sort of beginning of the conversation. So it changes the way that you enter the space. And I thought that particular work was really extraordinary, but also looking back at a lot of the work that Hulea has done, and how that is in a way sort of the image I think a lot of us maybe particularly, but maybe not particularly outside of Turtle Island and outside of the context of Native folks from those lands, are seeing the image of Native people in Turtle Island, and including the image of Two-Spirit people, and that survivance narrative that includes the history, that includes the future. there's an everlasting nature to a lot of her work, and she's a very celebrated artist and well known. But yeah, I guess the kind of story around her queerness and the centering of that is only known in certain spaces and ignored in others.
Yeah.
So yeah.
No, that's right, and it's fascinating to hear her talking about it a lot more now too, because there's an understanding of it. No, I should say that Helena and Veronica are actually married. So their work that they do has that as community as well. We visited lots of people. Is Suksavan Karaval, who is also a member of our centre, is Dine and is at Northern Arizona Uni, and that's the team.
And Suksavan also, completed or is completing a dual PhD, but
as a co-tell, that's right.
Yeah, as a co-tell also with our department.
So I should say doctor because they are already a doctor because they have their PhD from Oregon State University already. So they're at Northern Arizona Uni. We'll revisit them a few slides in. And we'll see them with their class, along with Halea with their class. And so this is E.J. Scott, Museum of Transology and Dog and Puppy, and very old puppy. And this is Madi, by the way, Madi Day, who isn't here, but is here in spirit and is here and doing a whole lot of work around anti-trans rhetoric at the moment to challenge that and to find strategies and ways to engage, but also to call it out. This was the UK. This was a very, very tricky part of this journey. The second half of the journey, which you've seen a lot of potted work from this year across the West Coast, including visiting Suksavan, visiting Halea and visiting a whole lot of remarkable people that you're yet to see. But earlier in the year, it had been visits to the UK and visits to the US that had led to a lot of cancellations of presentations that we were going to do. Mostly that I was going to do, but some of them would have been open to the whole team. And they were cancelled for various reasons, but all of them were because of transphobia. So in the case of two of the spaces, no, one of them, it was a viable gun threat. One of them, it was promise of, direct action against me speaking. And in other instances, there were other things that occurred that just basically meant that it had to be called off. Now, it's very easy to say that one was Arkansas and one was Texas, but I think it's really important to also say that one was Philadelphia. So the queerest place in the country, probably. I think San Francisco would have a bitch about that, but I'm not sure it's not true. So this happens in lots of places, including the places that we might not expect. And it was really frustrating to see it, but there's a context for that, and you can kind of go, okay, first of all, we did present in other places. We did have the opportunity to be able to present in London and in Edinburgh, and we did, and Toronto, we did have the opportunity to present across a whole lot of the work that we're doing. Audiences could come. There were lots of challenges to what was happening, but it's no surprise that in the centre of, the site of colonisation, or the site from which colonisation was wrought, the UK, that there would be all of this gender policing. So again, the container of gender that the UK has constructed over many hundreds of years, though not thousands. And I think it's important for us to recognise that, this is, again, sorry, but it's true for them too. If they exist now, they exist in the past and they exist in the future. So, this is a really central kind of position that we take, but it's not popular. for some people. Now, I think that they're a vocal minority, the people who are calling this out, but in the case of the UK, there's been a real creeping anti-trans, I'm not telling anyone who's here anything, you all know this, but there's been a creeping anti-trans position that has made a lot of institutions nervous. Museums get nervous really easily, especially big public museums that have kids going through them, which is unfortunate because if you're a trans adult, once you were a trans kid. And so, you know, this whole notion that children have to be protected from queer people is absolutely fucking nonsense. And it's something that we must challenge. So we met with E.J. Scott, who gave us a really remarkable insight into, we spent the day together walking along through all these wonderful sites of seeing statues that have not yet been torn down. Here's Captain Cook, that surely should come down at some stage. And we talked about all of the strategies that EJ has taken in not just developing up the Museum of Transology, which is a very transient museum that's shifted from Brighton to some public sites. It's now in Queer Britain, which I think you'll see a little bit further on. But you know, to talk about what they were doing was talking about the conversations that are happening, but also the resistances that are happening. And there are many resistances. So I won't cover the Hidden Histories Trail for a minute, but I'll just skip over to this if it's okay. This was a action that was happening over the other side of the presentation that I was doing in Edinburgh. And a whole lot of the people who were here at this action, which was trying to call off a transphobic film that happened to be showing magically at the exact same time that I was speaking at. And they called it off. In fact, they blocked off the building, which was let to them by the university. However, in counter, it was also people from the university who had me speaking. And this was people from the university and from the community protesting. There were maybe 3 of the anti-trans people who turned up. There were about 1,000, maybe more than that, of people who were supporting trans people or trans people who turned up to challenge it. And that's the thing about the vocal minority, is there's a lot of kind of work that's been happening to talk to media, to try to get media to do a whole lot of both sidesism with this. But you know, actually there's some really powerful stuff. But at the same time, and this has the diversity flag printed on it, I've just realized looking at this, but this is a QR code that you can, you know, I'm not even going to apologize for how blurry it is, because it's so fucking small. It had to be blurry for me to take the photo. Tiny little hidden section on hidden histories at Edinburgh Museum, a museum that I love and that featured strongly in the work of my previous project. It was remarkable in the way that they were really teasing out ideas of complexity of identity. And yet here they have, I think it's around 20 pieces that are in the collection that have this tag on them. And you can't read anything in the museum about where this queerness is found in this item. And with the exception of the Alexander McQueen piece, which does have something about queerness, none of them write anything about it in the main text. So you have to find it this way. So the idea of hidden histories, I mean, who are they being hidden from? Actually, the general public is the answer. It was also deeply problematic how they were constructed. I, you know, could write a book, which I won't bore you with, so I won't ever write that book, but on how problematic it was, the way that they kind of conflated ideas of slavery with queerness, and a whole lot of other things as well. So it was clearly written and put together, I hope, by somebody who wasn't queer. But it was also just made much more problematic by the fact that you have to QR code it, and then it's randomly all around the museum. This idea of, you know, search to find was there in a lot of places. They have the same thing, a Hidden Histories one here at Victoria and Albert. Sorry, I don't have that noted that it is. This is Victoria and Albert again in April of this year. I was there, and you know, they have this information about a pride flag, but it's really tiny and over behind it. This is really hard to find. It's sitting there by itself. You can look up to see it, but to locate it was actually quite tricky. And so, you know, a lot of this was not centered, but I was happy to see at least the word transgender appeared, you know, which almost was one of the only times that I saw trans rep there. Oh, that's Maddie and I at the British Museum, and also there. But that's also us at Queer Britain, which is a new museum, not very far away from the British Museum. And it's doing some really interesting work, actually. You know, it is creating this space where queerness is told through history. So it's a social history museum, and it's got a little bit of timeline stuff, but it's also got a lot about the power of particular moments. So we have, you know, moments like My Beautiful Laundrette, you know, a really important film in terms of representations of queerness in Britain in the 1980s. This is Museum of Transology's glass case. So there are pictures of trans people. There are tags with statements, stories, and then there are also some amazing tags of people who have had surgery. But there's lots of different representations that get swapped out. So remarkable. And, you know, it's absolutely about resistance, but it's also about really clear descriptions. You know, so they absolutely stated it, that they were supportive of trans people. And the reason that I say that is that trans people were absent from a lot of representation in Britain this time for me. So going into the pride display that they had just off the train station in Edinburgh, literally no trans flags and no diversity flags in there, you know, so nothing. And when I asked, they said they can't keep them because of protest, you know. So this is the situation. So when we headed over this time,
this is back to Turtle Island.
West Coast.
Yeah,
this is back to Turtle Island. Yeah, we arrived at the Oratory. Do you want to take over?
Yeah, so the Oratory is a museum that has, I guess, a complicated history, as being, you know, named after and centered originally on the work of Jean Autry, and this kind of idealized image of the Western, which is reproduced throughout, you know, Hollywood representations and this kind of thing. And the Oratory now had quite a long and complex interrogation of representations of the West, and the West in Turtle Island in particular, but how that actually has, you know, resonance and connection to many places around the world, and how Westerns as a, like, particularly as an entertainment form or as a concept on film, you know, have stories that have been picked up in many other places. They had a lot of examples. And at the same time, part of that was to recenter the discussion. Obviously, the Oratory is located in Los Angeles, very close by to Hollywood and the Hollywood sign, on Tongva land. And there was this amazing piece that really centered that this is taking place on Tongva land, and you know, did that work of it, like it did a lot of the work of like describing the way an imaginary has been set up in a place like Hollywood, and what that does to the stories of possession, dispossession, and particularly of colonization in that place, and the demonization and the very poor representations of Native peoples of that place, and to really instead tell the story of survivance and of the continuation of Tongva connection to country, and to then interrogate a lot of these stories of Westerns from that place. And that was amazing. There was even a corner that did also look at Native queer, queer, it was all like, it was queer representations and like activities and embodiments within a kind of Western context. So there was queer radios and things like this, but it did also include Native queerness briefly, but in a corner that's also the kids' corner, which is really interesting, right?
It was amazing. And the Queer Cowboys.
Yes.
Association from the 1970s was there. So, I mean, the Imagined West, sorry, that's why I was scooting through. I was checking whether I had any stuff on the Imagined West exhibition, which was really powerful. And because it talks, the fact that it calls that imagined, it recognizes that this construction of the West in the context of Westerns is really quite complex. And
I wonder if it gets people thinking about how the construction of the West in a broader, like, urological sense is also a bit of an imaginary construction. At least I would hope so.
Well,
but yes,
you know where we saw that really beautifully done at the National Museum of the American Indian, where they're talking about native New Yorker, which is a term that for me growing up meant people who were born in New York and lived in New York and lived the life of being in New York. But of course, it's deeply problematic when you consider New York as a native place. So I'm using the term native in the way that Indigenous people in the US use the term. So, so it's a really intriguing set of discussions that has this kind of puncturing of what we think we know. And of course, that's why the Tongva land that's not the Hollywood sign is so important here. You walk outside, because this is in Griffith Park, you walk outside and you can kind of go off to the side and see it and see the sign. It's not very far away. Actually, we visited Griffith Observatory, where you can see the sign kind of writ large in front of you. And, now I just fully expect to see Tongva land, there. But it was remarkable. So I was going to say, we don't have the images on here, but we'll make the images available. And in fact, I'll put them up on my Facebook page, which anybody can access. So it's not like we didn't see stuff. We were able to see some representations. They were there. But when they were, it was kind of like, oh my God, this is wonderful, rather than this is the representation that we deserve. So I'm talking about queer Indigenous representation here. And this is an example of, I'm not sure if you can read this, but it starts with, in 1914, it's written in English as well as Spanish. This is at the Field Museum in Chicago, a very large museum. And there's a lot of, Red Nation have done a remarkable, the podcast Red Nation have done a remarkable interrogation of their concerns about the field and the way that a natural history museum incorporates Indigenous people. However, no, not however, and yeah. I'd say there are some things that are really powerful in this space, and I think they're right. And I think this is one of the things that's powerful, and it's made powerful because, Kai Minosh Pyle wrote this piece. And I have said I really wished as I approached it that it had been written by one of the curators there, but they had the good sense to engage Kai in this as well. And and Dr. Pyle is doing some really remarkable work on recalling and remembering the place of trans Indigenous people, Two-Spirit people within their histories. So in 1914, a scandal arose when the ex-wife of a Milwaukee man named Ralph Cowaneo reported to the police that he had been born with the name Cora Anderson to African-American and Potawatomi parents in Indiana. Though newspapers were shocked at his gender expression, Kueneo's story shows how even when society is disapproving, individuals still find ways to live the way they want to live. So this very powerful piece is centered for all the kids who go through the Field Museum to read this. You know, this is very, you don't really get a sense of scale, unfortunately, but this is very large. These are kind of AO sized, and then the one below it is double that. So there's very large pieces and very centrally placed as well. So you wouldn't, sometimes when people do museums, they run out of steam by the time they get to a particular point. You wouldn't run out of steam. People would be seeing this, and it's in front of it is a kind of gathering place. So just like Han was talking about with the queer cowboy stuff being there in the Oratory, in the kids' place, this is a place where kids are going to be able to view this. So there it is, just in case anybody needs to another look at it. So unsurprisingly, just like with the work of Kai and with all of the work, you know, the Oratory changes when an Indigenous director comes on. It changes in form when you have curators who are Indigenous, right? And I know this from the research that I did years ago. Actually, I just know this as an Indigenous person. The more that you have people with lived experience, the more that there is kind of a responsibility, not just a knowledge of it, but there's both, right? And so we were really lucky to have, this was luck.
It was. I mean, maybe it was, yeah.
So this was First Nations Longhouse at University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And you know, they have a remarkable both house of learning and a library, and they also curate into the main library. And so this was a display. I'm going to scoot past it just to go to Taya Jardine, who, along with, sorry, that's Leanne Rowe Wallace, who is postdoc on, is a doctoral student on the project, on our project. That's Alana Blakers, who is also a postgrad student on the project, Han and I, and then that's Taya Jardine, who is doing remarkable work. But one of the things that they did was put together these displays. They're displays that cover off on, actually, I think it's 5 sections, and I think I only have 3 of them here, unfortunately. Transforming Embers to Spirit Wellness. I'll get you to speak to it, but I'll just go through them quickly. They have some stuff on literature and on poetry, a piece, one on poetry as well, and then one for the youth. Yeah, so I think I'm missing the poetry one and then one other one.
Yeah, it was an amazing collection. I should also note that Taya also has a connection with our department at you know, the Indigenous Studies Department at Macquarie University, having done some study there on exchange, but is now a librarian in Vancouver and an Indigenous librarian in the Indigenous specific library. So this exhibit, though, wasn't in the Indigenous library, it was in the main library space. Yeah, and it was sort of in the, like, just at the base of the stairs where you go into the kind of book section of the library, and where a lot of students are working, and you know, it's a sort of transition space as well. So it's a very visible exhibit that, yeah, it displays a lot of work by Two-Spirit and queer Indigenous folks, including Colouring the Rainbow is a collection of writings from this continent, from the continent claimed by Australia, and so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander queer folk. And you know, it really showed the breadth of stuff that is published, the breadth of imaginaries. Two-Spirit acts as a collection of scripts and performances talking about queer Indigenous performers. There's a QR code there for the Ota Nikan, which is a magazine of queer Indigenous writings. There's graphic novel collections. It was a really thorough collection that that was then, you know, presenced in this broader space, and that was quite extraordinary to see. Yeah. And Taya talked
really
about the sort of process of like making those displays, and that there's a lot of like personal items from the various librarians particularly who are queer, who you know, contributed hair clips or other personal items to the display, and that was really special.
Oh yeah, and Taya's also an artist, isn't it terrible? These people who are artists. Oh, and there's also queer. Sorry, I think they'd have a go at me for not saying that. So we went to somewhere called La Brea Tar Pits in Los Angeles. And I've got this at First Flush Correctives as a kind of, this was a drag story time. When I knew that we had a day that we could be looking at various representations in Los Angeles, obviously we visited the Autry and Griffith Observatory for the way that they're framing representations. So these were, you know, these are really important spaces in a lot of ways. I don't know that I thought the Tar Pits, which focuses mostly on particular, well, it's mostly got megafauna that it focuses on. So some dinosaurs, some fossils and dinosaurs, but also megafauna. So a more recent era. And it's an active tar pit, but you can see, if I think I've got a photo of it exploding in the car park and then putting like a witch's hat on the explosion. Bless. So so when I knew there was a queer family day that was happening on a day that we were there, and so rather than simply going and seeing the way that community is described, which is one of the things that we were very interested in, and we probably wouldn't be going to, you know, something that is effectively a natural history museum to be doing that. It was important for us to see it for this reason, you know, because drag story times have often been centered, you know, and this is drag, not trans, just to be extremely clear, but the conflations by others have meant that that oftentimes drag has been the center called out problem that anti-trans and anti-queer activists are focused on. In fact, EJ told us that the work that they've been doing at the Tate has often been about protecting and finding strategies for drag performers to be able to engage with the space rather than for trans performers in that context of the showing that Tate Britain has been doing. They've centered a whole lot of queer activity, and it's thanks to work by EJ, actually, EJ Scott. So we went to this, and look, it was good. It was really interesting. It was interesting to hear that. It was great to kind of see it centered. There were kids around, but there was also a lot of binary gendering language that the performers were using. And there was someone who left, you know, a young kid who made a comment and left in the middle of our of the show. And it's sort of, it's the reminders of the complexity of this. People aren't getting this right all the time. You know, there is this idea of representation. Often it's not, you know, really complex in the way that it describes who we are and who we can be. And kids can come to something like this and not feel included. There are a lot of kids that did feel included too, by the way. So, you know, so the correctives, and we kind of posed for this photo as a kind of corrective thing. This is, again, Alana and I, are about pushing that, are about asserting that. You know, it's part of the resistances that we have within movements as well. So this was us.
This is in Flagstaff at Northern Arizona Uni, in Suksavan's class, Dr. Suksavan Karabuth. And so we spoke with the class about a lot of the situation for Indigenous folks in the lands claimed by Australia. And in particular, this was very shortly after the referendum result. And the kids were really curious to hear about the linked struggles. And it, I think, disrupted some ideas of that can be held about Australia, particularly in light of, you know, gun control laws and things that make it seem like a bit more of a progressive place than it necessarily is. And then this is with the amazing Professor Hulea's class in Davis, where they were, like, when we entered, they were mid a screen printing workshop and clearing things up. And then we also had a great discussion with them about the work we've been doing that, yeah, was also quite a vibrant back and forth. So that was wonderful.
Yeah, and I mean, that essentially, I'll come to an end to that. That essentially is the is the work that we're doing. Now, it's not everywhere that we went, and everyone that we met and everything that we were talking about. It's not all the work that we're writing about, but it's some of the people who gave time to be able to explain to us, gave us a space to be able to explain about the things that really matter, and also the things that we want to hear more about. You know, we're not there to try and say what's happening there is the same as what's happening here. What's happening here isn't the same as what's happening here. You know, it depends on people, it depends on circumstances. But unfortunately,
and what's the same is the kind of like meeting with, you know, the colonial violence and the logics that includes.
Exactly. And so very specifically, what we found was that a lot of the anti-trans stuff was shared because colonialities are colonialities. You know, they become shared because they're strategies that they can use to embolden themselves. And so a lot of the anti-trans stuff that's now very heavily targeting Indigenous people and communities was happening there very similarly to how it's happened here. And it's recent. It's really recent. And so countering that has to be through complexity. This is a lot of the work that Maddie Day is doing at the moment. It's the work that we're doing with our projects, and there's a number of other people who are doing remarkable work. You know, this is about shaping policy and change. It's about being very careful with the way that we describe and define people. You know, I have a lot of counter to the idea of using exclusively certain terms. Not everybody uses two-spirit. Where I've used it here, it's when people use it themselves to describe themselves. So it's, you know, and when they do it publicly, you know, otherwise I'm using the term queer, or I'm using specific terms that people use for themselves. And look, this is very much the same for us here. You know, we often get the whole idea, we don't use the term two-spirit here, of course. It's a relatively recent term. It's only been around for a bit over 30 years, maybe 35 years now. And, you know, it's a term that was really helpful, but it belongs on Turtle Island to describe some people, for some people to use to describe themselves. And in the report that Dr. Percy wrote, you actually see some complexity to the way that that's explained as well. You see it also in the report that I mentioned that came from the hospital, from Dr. Bell's team as well. So it's not an either or, you know. But what we see here often is that we see people using terms like sister girl or brother boy as terms that are excluding terms, so that all trans people are one or the other. And obviously for somebody who's non-binary, who has a problem with those terms to describe myself, not to describe other people. People should be able to use whatever terms they want to describe themselves, of course. And for a lot of people, they're the appropriate terms. But oftentimes organizations will use these as a very easy way to talk about including Indigenous people. And we're not easy. You know, we're complex, and we should be complex, and we're in community with one another. So it's not,
and it's a refusal to really attend to those complexities.
It's a
And
refusal to attend to those complexities, and also a desire to kind of show support through language. And instead, what they could be doing is showing support through language, but also showing support in other ways. And so there's some resistances like that that are really unhelpful in trying to solve a problem. We're not a problem, and Indigenous support is not a problem. So Indigenous queerness is not a problem, and Indigenous queerness doesn't have solutions either. We're not a solution to non-Indigenous people finding their own voice, talking about, well, Indigenous queer people have been here forever, so that means we have too. No, it's not that either. And so there's a complexity to this. The Visner's line about if we exist now, we exist in the past, we exist in the future is about Indigenous survivors. Certainly, I would say that there is, you can learn from Indigenous survivance, and you can engage that idea of survivance. You can engage the idea of complexity of community without appropriating it, and
and without flattening it and saying it's the same when there's a lot of, specificities. And I guess terms like queer, that has obviously its own complexities, and used as this kind of catch-all umbrella term, especially if it's not, the term that people are using to describe themselves, comes with challenges, and we want to, not discount those challenges, but at the same time, the reclamation of the term has its own kind of power, that we find, it reads something more. I mean, this is the kind of like not gay as in, but queer as in, it is in itself a challenge to kind of notions of static categories and these boxes, as Prof says, the kind of colonial project of gender, and the boxes that we're asked to conform to fit ourselves into. And so we continue to use this term queer for its resistance to that kind of restriction and categorization, and the acknowledgement that the terms that we're using now, will ebb and flow throughout time, and that doesn't change the fact that, yes, the survivance, particularly of queer Indigenous folks, existing now, existing always in the past, and always into the future.
And people will use terms like Sister Girl is a really good example. Now, Sister Girl, many of you will know that there is a book by Jackie Huggins called Sister Girl, because this is a term that was used by women, trans or cis, to describe relationships to one another. I grew up saying Sister Girl. And so the idea that this is exceptionalized to only talk about trans women is just forgetting that actually what it's doing is saying trans women are women. Actually, Aboriginal trans women are women. So it's forgetting that, but of course it's not really knowing it in the first place. So these impositions are often by others, in terms of the idea that this term means only one thing. And so we do a lot of work on these resistances. That work is in our writing, and it's in the way that we describe this in the kind of broader public imaginary. So we'll include some links to some stuff below, but also links to some of these wonderful people that we've talked about. But yeah, I just wanted to really thank, I can't tell you enough that I wouldn't have been able to do this work without all of these people that were involved in this, but in particular, I wouldn't have been able to do any of this work without Han. So I'm so thankful to you for the opportunity to kind of extend the work that has been happening. And we extend always in conversation. We extend always in community. It's kind of the only way to do it, right?
Absolutely. So. Yes, I am grateful for your thanks, but I very much, and by definition, would not be able to be doing this work without my relationship with you, Prof. And so this has also very much extended my work, obviously on this project, but also my work outside of it. And so, yeah, the it's definitely a two-way relationship, and a lot of sharing that is, and thinking together, and in each other's company, that I think, makes everything stronger and richer. And the fact that all of these other people that we've talked about, and even a lot of the places that we've visited and the works that we've seen, that enriches the conversation, that's being in relationship with those things, that enhances the thinking. And so being able to do this travel, and to really be situated in these places, and to visit and discuss with people is, so deeply integral to this work, and what we're able to think with and about coming out of it. So
Thanks again. Lots of links below, and please get in touch with us if there's anything that you need to get in touch with us about. Thanks again.
Thank you.